not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. I know what you're thinking. This is the last verse I would put up there to talk about leading the family. Hate your children? Hate your wife? The word hate here, if you look it up in Greek, actually means to esteem less. It's not that you hate these people, but you understand God comes first. God is the foundation. When we need advice, we go to God. We put Him first. We put His word first. That's how we raise our children. What would it look like if we put our children before God? Well, instead of turning to my Bible for advice on how to raise my children, if the children are first, I'll just turn to my children. I'll ask them, how should I raise you? I'll get lots of great feedback. Candy every meal. Sodas whenever they want them. Bedtimes, nap times, none of that's necessary. We obviously can't ask our children, how do we raise you? We need to look to the Bible. So I'm going to step on Steve's lesson just for a minute here, but foundationally in a home, you have to have a good husband-wife relationship. If you look at Ephesians chapter 5, verses 25 and then 28 and 29, it says, "Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her." And then down to 28, "So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church." There's a foundation there. If you want to raise children in a godly manner, you can't build that on top of an improper husband-wife relationship. You know, the Bible goes into detail about what love is. There's many passages that talk about what love is. But fundamentally, it's not just words. It's not just saying, I love you. It's your actions. It's how you interact. And I'm not going to go too much into that because I think Steve's going to cover that a lot more in his lesson. The next area we're going to look at is discipline. Discipline is not a popular thing, especially not in today's world. We're going to look at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 7 through 11. "If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten? But if you are without chastening, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate and not sons. Furthermore, we have had human fathers who corrected us, and we paid them respect. Shall we not much more readily be in subjection to the Father of spirits and live? For they indeed for a few days chastened us as seemed best to them, but He for our profit, that we may be partakers of His holiness. Now no chastening seems to be joyful for the present, but painful. Nevertheless, afterward it yields the peaceable fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." The Bible talks about methods of discipline, but fundamentally, discipline needs to be effective. You see here in the last verse that it yields this peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Regardless of how we discipline our children, it needs to be effective. I can't just say, I've picked this one method of discipline and I'm going to stick with it no matter what. If you're a leader, to be effective, if what you're doing is not working, and I mean you've truly tried it, it's not working, you don't just give up. You don't just throw your hands in the air and say it's impossible. You try something different. You change your methods. You never change the fact that you're raising your children in a godly manner, but if one thing isn't working, you try something else. Not every child reacts the same way to every discipline. You know, things that worked with Lily don't work with Caleb and vice versa. So we have to be flexible. We have to be willing to change. You know, the world would say, don't discipline your children at all. Let kids be kids. That will not result in the peaceful fruit of righteousness. You know, they have to be trained to get that. And if we're not disciplining them or chastening them, that word really also means training. We need to be training our children. But can we do too much? Can you over-discipline your children? Well, let's look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4, and also Colossians 3, verse 21. Ephesians 6:4 says, "And you fathers, do not provoke your children to wrath, but bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord." And then Colossians 3:21 says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children, lest they become discouraged." How does someone become discouraged? Have you ever been discouraged? You ever been at a job and just the way your boss treated you really discouraged you? There's a point when you can have too much correction. A child is not going to be perfect. Does that mean you don't discipline them at all? No, that's not what I'm saying. But if they color outside the line on a coloring page, you don't have to fix it every single time. Have you ever known somebody that no matter what you did, they could do it better? Or they could tell you how you did it wrong, you should have done it like this, why didn't you do it like that? How did that make you feel? Did that make you feel positively about yourself? I'm going to guess not. We don't need to treat our children that way. Yes, they'll make mistakes. Yes, we need to correct them. I'm not in any way discounting that. But we can't pick apart every single thing they do. We can't be too overly hard on them. Now, different situations require different responses. But if we are so hard on them that they become discouraged because of how we're acting, we've taken it too far. We don't like to talk about this in church because it makes us feel uncomfortable, but there are situations of abuse in this world. And I'm not talking about what the world calls abuse, where, you do any little thing and it's suddenly abusive. I'm talking about legitimate abuse. That's not how you raise your children. Nowhere in the Bible does it say to truly abuse your children. We do not need to make our children bitter. So how do we do it? So I talked about how we don't do it. How do we train our children without doing these things to discourage them? We train them by example. If we look at Titus chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. Titus 2, 6 through 8. "Likewise, exhort the young men to be sober-minded, in all things showing yourselves to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, a sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say of you." He uses the word pattern there. What's a pattern? A pattern is something you follow. A pattern is something you copy. It's an example. You know what isn't a pattern? Complaining. Just complaining about something isn't setting a pattern. That's not setting an example. If I come home and the kids are watching TV, and I go, kids shouldn't be watching so much TV, and wander off, have I led by example there? No, I haven't. What should I do? I should come home, I should see my children and my exasperated wife who's been taking care of them all day, and I should set an example by saying, "Honey, I know you're tired. I'm going to watch the kids for a while so you can take a break. And if I don't like them watching the TV, then I will get out a board game, or take them outside, or get out some cardboard and construction paper and we'll make a craft." That's an example. I'm not just complaining about the situation. I'm fixing it. I'm resolving it. I'm setting a pattern. The other thing you have to have for a pattern is you have to have the pattern. You have to be present. You have to be involved. If we were going to make a craft, and we were going to cut pieces out of cardboard to put the craft together, and we have a pattern, but the pattern's not here. It's not at the building. The pattern's in another town. The pattern's off doing something else. How effectively can we make that craft? We know in a physical world, if we're doing woodworking and we're tracing something, but we don't have the thing to trace, we can't trace it very well. We all have things that require our time. Like I have to work a job, I have to be gone a certain amount of time during the day. But what do I do when I get home? Do I pick a hobby that has me gone the rest of the day so that I get home, change clothes, and I leave, and my kids don't see me again because I'm off doing something else the remainder of the day? Or am I there? Do I take time to invest in my children by being present, there for them to look at. That's how you be a pattern. You're present. You're there so they can see you, they can pattern after you. Lastly, we need to seek godly advice. You know, this building is full of people that have successfully raised children. That's where we need to turn. I made the joke before about just looking at things up on the internet. That's not what we do. If we look at Luke chapter 7, verse 35, it says, "But wisdom is justified by all her children." Now, in this context, Jesus is talking about some teachers or some people that were saying things they shouldn't. But I think this principle is true here. If you want to know how to raise children properly, talk to someone who has properly raised children. I have gotten some advice over the years that sounded really, really good. It sounded like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then you look at the children of the people who gave you the advice, and you think, I don't know about that philosophy. That really didn't turn out so well in the end. I think we have to be careful about who we're asking for advice. And like I say, this building is full of a lot of excellent people that would be great to ask advice from, much better than looking things up on the internet. So that's all I had prepared this morning. I know Steve, he's going to talk about some other leadership in the home. I hope some of the things I said were practical and help you out.
Before I get into this part, we'll be studying some one chapter books of the Bible our next quarter, and we'll start with Obadiah next week. Don't have the quarterlies yet, but should have them there. So those of you that are regularly in this class, you will go ahead and start studying the Old Testament prophet Obadiah, and we'll get into that, and then you can look up some of the other one chapter books that we have, Old New Testament, and you know kind of where we're going next week. You know, as John was talking and started with that passage of loving or actually hating mother and father, as he pointed out correctly so, it means to love less. But you know, how do we really love our children? We do that by loving God. There's no better way for us to express our love for our children than for us to love God. The same thing would be true in the husband-wife relationship. Being leaders as husbands and wives. I also was thinking about Ephesians chapter 5, where Jesus is talking about the church, and he's using the family, the husband-wife relationship in reference to the way that the church works. And I'm not really sure whether Paul was, his main point was the family or his main point was the church, but he uses both pretty much interchangeably. So as we think about, you know, being leaders there, definitely Paul, in talking about, you know, even as Christ loved the church, that's the way that husbands are to love their wives. And if you back up there, verse 21 and 22 in Ephesians 5, you know that he's talking about submission particularly to authority. And one of the reasons that our families are not what they ought to be is because we've not done real well in finding our roles and in fulfilling those roles. There are a lot of wives, there are a lot of mothers that have had to take leadership because the husband wouldn't do it. Sometimes because he's not there or whatever. And I think, you know, again, John made a good point, even in reference to the kids. You know, if the kids are doing things that we don't want them to do, or if they're going in directions that we don't want them to go in, what we need to do is look at our role and be truly a role model for our kids. You may remember a few years ago when this idea of being role models was really in the news, and Charles Barkley, most of you know that the basketball player, and he's still all over the television when you're talking about basketball, but he made the statement publicly that he was not a role model. Well, he could say that, but he is, and he was. And the same thing is true with you and me. We may deny that, but our children and others are looking to us. And so, how do we become really good leaders in our family? Well, as husbands, we need to look at what God wants us to be. And when we truly become what God wants us to be, then we're going to be the type of husbands in those leadership roles that God wants us to be in. That's true in leading our families, with our wives and our children. One of my favorite statements about Abraham is in Genesis chapter 18 and verse 19. And it's interesting in this context that the Lord is dealing with Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is where Abraham sort of pleads for them. If there's 50 righteous, 45, 40, and he works us all the way down to 10. But before he gets into that, this is what God says about Abraham. For I have known him, this is verse 19, in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of the Lord to do righteousness and justice, that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he has spoken to him. He was commanding his household and his children after him, that they might know the way of righteousness. Does this mean that he was, an authoritarian, or he was lording it over his family? Not at all. It is to suggest that Abraham was very conscious of his responsibility within his family, and he was willing to teach them and to train them so that they truly would know the way that God would have them to go. And it's interesting that after making that statement, he goes on to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's really why he was even talking to Abraham anyway, was because of Abraham's faithfulness, Abraham's righteousness. Now, you may be thinking, Abraham didn't always get that done. No, but neither do you or I. We make mistakes. We don't always lead as we should. We don't always act as we should. And God knows that. He's asking us within our families to work at being good husbands, to work at being good wives, to be very conscious of the influence that we have, over our children. It is really sad to see, how we've lost our children over the years. And it may, at least in part, be because we have, turned them over to the television or to the types of things that they learn at school. Someone was telling me, I don't know, last couple of months, about a little boy that I think is second grade, and she was talking about his language. She said he knows every four-letter word that's ever come down the pipe. Second grader. How did he learn it? Probably somewhat the internet, but I suspect that's the kind of language that his parents use, and maybe he is allowed to watch any kind of garbage that he wants to watch. And he don't even know the meanings of most of these four-letter words that he uses. And the teacher is really struggling to try to tell him he can't say that in the class. But I don't know how successful she's been, but I know she's been pretty saddened and frustrated with that type of a dilemma. Back to Abraham, what did Abraham talk about? He evidently talked about righteousness. He talked about what they needed to do and how that they needed to live. So Abraham was a good leader within that family, with his children and even the servants that were there. In Ephesians 5, again, he talks about, loving, husbands loving their wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And of course, Christ was willing to die on the cross of Calvary. If husbands are willing to do that, are willing to, give everything, then the wife is able then to honor what God says here about submission, and that she's able to follow the leadership of her husband because of his love for God, and that's the way that truly he expresses his love for her. So leadership from a husband-wife standpoint really, I think, comes down to us having a proper respect for God and a proper respect for God's Word. And that's why we have faith many times, is because we've not studied our Bibles as we should. We've not prayed as we should. We've not looked at the kind of men that God wants us to be to the degree that we should have. And from the female standpoint, many times have not looked at that role from a biblical standpoint to the degree that we should. And so when we don't do that, obviously we say things and we do things that are not going to give the guidance and the leadership within the family that we should. Now, my topic, actually, I'm not started on yet. My topic was leadership within the family where there were no children. And I thought, well, Matthew was going to talk about the husband-wife leadership. John has the children. And then my topic actually had to do with that. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And one of the things as I started thinking about that was for me to realize that in comparison to some other things, the Bible doesn't say a lot about the families of the individuals that we read about. For example, I thought about Barnabas. We're introduced to him in Acts chapter 4. Talk about the fact that he had property and he sold it and brought that money to the apostles. Was Barnabas married? Did he have children? Well, we don't know. We do know that he went on to be a preacher and a missionary. I'm going to guess that he probably didn't have a family because he was able to do that. Paul, same thing can be said of Paul. Philip, in Acts chapter 8, we do know that he was married and he had 4 daughters. And they're mentioned particularly in reference to Philip going to Caesarea and continuing his work there after preaching the gospel to the Ethiopian eunuch, Acts chapter 8. We know that Peter had a mother-in-law. That's what you get when you get a wife, It looks like that'd be different, But, anyway, you get a wife, you get a mother-in-law. Well, Peter had one. And so, did he have children? I would first say, I don't know. But we know from 1 Peter 5, I guess it is, that he was an elder in the church, and elders had to have wives and children. So but the Bible really doesn't say anything about those children. So, looking at it from that angle, I think that as we look at leadership there, Barnabas was a great leader. He was a leader from the standpoint that he was a good encourager. We know that he was a very, very generous, very liberal in the use of his property for the benefit of the church. In fact, a little bit later, when the church of Jerusalem heard about the growth of the church up in Antioch, and that people other than the Jews were being converted, who did they send? They sent Barnabas. So Barnabas goes and he sees what's going on, and he approves of what is going on. And then he goes and gets Saul, later the Apostle Paul, and brings him there. And that's sort of how that relationship got started between Paul and Barnabas and the 3 missionary journeys we don't know about Barnabas in all 3 of them, but we know that he went on the first, and he also did a second missionary trip as well. But the leadership of Barnabas, I think, is truly seen in his Christian character. And did he have children? We don't know. But I think he would have been the type of person that if, he was here for our Bible study this morning, I wouldn't mind at all my kids and my grandkids sitting with Barnabas. But that's you. He just seems to have been that kind of person that truly was looked up to and respected. Same thing could be true of some of these other individuals as well. So God put all of us in leadership roles, and even if they are not my children, you and I can influence those children, even though they're not yours, just in speaking to some of these little ones when they're running around here this morning. Do you talk to them? Do you know their names? They're of course, you got to be careful, that they might run over you. But do you talk to them? One of the most precious things that is never forgotten, I think, by little children is attention. Attention. I hope that if you don't know their names, you'll take the time to speak to them, take time to smile at them, realizing that one of these days, Caleb or Lucas are going to be up here where I am. You wouldn't believe it right now, And I guess Caleb will still have his Mario cap on, but they're growing and they're learning, and us big people, are influencing them right now. The teenagers, taking time to speak, and taking time to get to know them, to learn what's going on with them at school, and what do they like, and what do they want to do, what do they want to be. There is a role that all of us play with other people's kids. And even though mine are grown and we're in that grandparent stage, we need to be the kind of role models, not just to our own, but to others as well, and try to set examples so that they can see that. And of course, the same thing is true with the women as well as with the men. There's a fellow, I think I'll just say I don't know if he's still living or not, but he worshiped at West Avenue Church of Christ out of Crossville at the time. And every time that I was ever there, I was there in a meeting and a workshop. But every time he gave me a piece of candy, and he gave, especially the kids, but he would give visitors and everything. And I've often thought of that and thought, obviously I've not forgotten it. I don't think I'll ever forget it. But it was such a nice individual. He was having an influence, and he was speaking to people in the process. He was giving you a piece of candy, whether you wanted it or not. But he left a strong impression there. Tom Holland, who did our lectureship here for many, many years, where he regularly preached, he would go get those Susan B. Anthony, they were dollars, wasn't it? Yeah. And he, every so often, at the back door, when the kids came out, he gave them $1. You think they ever forgot that? They were not his kids, and I don't know if he even knew all of their names. The church is pretty good size there. But, he took time to think about them. He took time to give them something. He took time, I think, to let the kids know that they were important. And I think that whether we have children of our own, whether we have grandkids of our own, or whether we're past that stage, we all can be very influential to our children, as well as to adults, if we take time to give attention. That's why, we've got about a dozen young ladies. How many of you spoke to them already? Okay, pretty good. Oh, good. Okay, the rest of you now made you aware that they're here, but they're here for a retreat. They're from Cookville, Tennessee Tech. I don't know if it's a college retreat or it's whatever. Anyway, they're here. But they're going to go away, and I suspect never be here again. What are they going to remember? I think they'll remember whether or not we were really friendly and courteous, and whether we talked to them and spoke to them. Others, the same way. We have a powerful influence there. Got about 30 seconds. Anybody with a question or comment? Okay, I appreciate, this leadership thing. Hopefully it's helped all of us to be made aware of the importance of being leaders. Yes?
What John said before about having a pattern, I think that's a great analogy, but to add to that, the pattern needs to be consistent in order for it to work properly.
Right.
So I think that's another thing you need to add to disciplining children is being consistent.
Yeah, I agree. Consistency in discipline, consistency basically in our lives. That we are tomorrow or we are today. It's not just a one-day thing, but we need to be consistent in our lives and our Christianity. Good point. Okay, remember next week we'll start Obadiah.